Hello? Is anybody here?
It was the 25th of December 2019, 8:15 p.m. I just started playing Resident Evil 2 Remake for the first time and had just arrived at the Raccoon City Police Department. It was the 26th of December, 4:08 a.m. when I realized that I had just experienced something monumental. On that day, I finished the Leon campaign of Resident Evil 2 Remake in a single sitting. I had watched Let's Plays of Resident Evil Remake and Resident Evil 7 before, but it took me until that night to finally play one of the games myself. My journey through the franchise has left me as a huge fan of Leon, and I do really adore Jill as well. While I do still appreciate Resident Evil 2 a lot, the Resident Evil game I love the most is Resident Evil 4, both the original and the remake. The mix of snappy gun combat with melee attacks used for crowd control, positioning and dealing damage, the cheesy one-liners and incredible pacing
End of the line, asshole!
are what make both versions of RE4 my favorite games in the entire franchise. So imagine my excitement when I first read the leaks that Leon S. Kennedy would be the main character of Resident Evil 9. Then imagine my surprise when he was not revealed to be in the game during the first trailer, nor the second trailer. What we got instead was footage of Grace Ashcroft, and a seemingly bigger focus on survival horror, more akin to RE2. The disappointment of Leon not having been revealed and the first couple of trailers for the game being pretty lackluster made me feel quite lukewarm on the game at first. But by now, we all know how the story went. Leon eventually got revealed to a gigantically positive fan reception. And this reception also extended to the full game itself. The game has been out for a little bit now and its resonance with fans has been incredible. But I have to admit, I didn't enjoy RE9 as much as I hoped I would. I returned to the survival horror of RE2, I returned to Raccoon City as well as a return to Leon, all in one game. What more could I have wanted? A lot more, it turns out. The thing is, RE9 is a game of two halves. One half is a tribute to RE1, RE2 and everything classic about Resident Evil. The other half though, Leon's half, is a tribute to RE4, RE5 and even RE6. And while it, on paper, contains most of everything I love about Resident Evil 4, it falls short in essential aspects which ultimately led to Leon's sections being disappointing. Against all odds and all expectations, the beginning sections focusing on franchise newcomer Grace Ashcroft would turn out to be the obvious standout. After an introductory sequence featuring both Grace and then also Leon, we enter the first proper area of the game, Rhodes Hill. This is also where a huge monster called the Girl starts pursuing Grace. Rhodes Hill is the clear peak of the game. It's a beautiful building to explore with unlockable doors, shortcuts, a clear sense of progression and numerous zombies to encounter. Here, RE9 very obviously harkens back to the RPD segment of RE2, remake or not, and the Spencer Mansion of RE1. You set out to explore the hospital on your own accord, having to find items which allow you to progress to other parts of the hospital, which in turn allow you to find new items that then let you go back to previously explored sections and open additional doors. There's always something new around every corner. That of course includes obscure puzzles as well as zombies. Zombies in RE9 are quite different compared to the ones from RE2 Remake, RE1 or even RE3 Remake. Instead of essentially all being the same, simple monsters you can deal with in the same way every time, they've all got individual personalities and sometimes even abilities which differentiate them from one another. There still are normalish zombies who don't do anything that stands out in particular, but those are relatively rare. More common, or at least more memorable, are the likes of the cook who's swinging his gigantic knife while towering over you and who has to be evaded unless you want to become minced meat. There are zombies who react to light and always want to shut it off, There are cleaning ladies who want to keep the floor clean at all times. There are singing zombies, there are blind but noise sensitive zombies, and more. All of these don't necessarily require different ways of dealing with them, but it is definitely encouraged. A noise sensitive zombie can be distracted by throwing a glass, or can be baited into fighting other zombies near him. A zombie sensitive to light can be distracted by turning on lamps, which he will then attempt to turn off, essentially making these zombie interactions into small puzzles. I do have to admit that I somewhat prefer the simpler approach of the prior games. Stealthing around zombies and using these mechanics to engage with them is, to me, more of a distraction from the fun gameplay loop of running past zombies and evading their attacks, or fighting them with everything you have left. But the fact is that you can still engage them in pretty much the same way as in RE2 and the like. You don't have to engage with their quirks and can treat them like any other zombie if you want, even if it isn't encouraged. The thing is, Grace is quite powerless throughout the entire game, mostly relying on a pistol and Leon's revolver, the Requiem.
Take this.
You sure?
You might need it. Now go.
The Requiem packs a punch, but its ammo is so limited that it should only be used when absolutely necessary. Then there's the dedicated crouch button, the ability to distract zombies by throwing bottles or even using their ticks to your advantage, and, later on, the ability to perform sneak attacks that usually kill enemies in a single hit. The game actively encourages you to take the stealthy approach and even discourages you from killing enemies, which is especially true when playing on harder difficulties. For one, because killing enemies is a waste of already quite sparse resources, and for two, because enemies aren't really dead when they seem to be. After a certain amount of time, zombies get back up and turn into even deadlier crimson heads that take more damage and are a lot quicker than their normal counterparts. Which means that the best thing you can do is to either avoid enemies completely or shoot them but not kill them, and then use Grace's melee attacks to push them to the ground, which both works as crowd control when surrounded by multiple enemies because it makes you invincible during the pushing animation, but also allows you to have an easier time running away from them. After exploring Rhodes Hill for a bit, Grace unlocks the ability to craft ammunition and special items with blood. Blood is either obtainable from buckets spread throughout Rhodes Hill or from enemies themselves, though in that case you have to kill them first, which at least gives an additional benefit to dedicating your ammo to a kill instead of just avoiding enemies completely. The blood crafting also allows you to craft hemolytic injectors, which allow you to kill most enemies in a single hit as long as you sneak up on them from behind. Doing this is quite important, by the way, because Grace doesn't end up getting any more guns than the ones she starts out with. Sure, you can find a slightly more powerful pistol, but there are no shotguns, no machine guns, nothing like that. Grace's arsenal is incredibly limited, which makes using the stuff she does have available even more necessary. By the end of the Rhodes Hill section, you've explored a mansion-like building, an underground sewer section, and eventually even a small laboratory, including a self-destruct sequence that Grace has to escape from. This all leads to a big confrontation with the girl, a pretty simple boss encounter, and then Grace's escape. The first section of the game is essentially a classic Resident Evil game on its own. It has all of the hallmarks of what we've come to expect from a Resi game, except that it's quite short with a length of about 6 hours during my first playthrough. Grace's escape also marks the point where the game finally switches its perspective to Leon for an extended period of time. This is also when Leon arrives in Raccoon City, since Grace has been kidnapped and he decides to go after her. This is also where I stopped my first play session. My mind was racing with possibilities as I went to bed, thinking about what the game had in store for me after the already pretty amazing section in Rhodes Hill. Since Rhodes Hill already felt like a pretty complete game of its own, I wondered how Leon's part could build on it even further. Would it be classic RE level design or something more similar to Resi 4's linear design? I couldn't wait to experience more of Leon's action gameplay and, of course, simply more of Leon's one-liners.
Well, that's my cardio for the week.
But most importantly, How would the narrative continue? Requiem has a pretty strong narrative hook for anyone who is familiar with the series. It's made clear early on that there is a virus affecting survivors of the Raccoon City outbreak from 28 years ago, Leon included.
Leon, we're running out of time.
The most popular character of the franchise has returned to where it all began for him, and where it all began for a good chunk of modern Resident Evil fans, including myself. Raccoon City immediately differs from Rhodes Hill in multiple ways. It is way more spacious, you're able to roam the streets of the destroyed town, not during nighttime, not even during a storm. It is completely bright outside, even with the overcast sky. And at first, the city is completely empty. After fighting a gigantic spider and exploring an abandoned military or BSAA camp, you receive your first proper objective in Raccoon City. Leon has to collect 3 detonator parts in order to bomb his way through a gate, which will then allow him to pursue Grace further. This is where you get to explore a very open-ended area of Raccoon City. The game makes you go to several different locations that are, like in Grace's sections, partly closed off until you find items that let you continue your journey. In that sense, this Raccoon City section is more like RE2 than RE4, since it's not really linear and you're allowed to take different routes, as long as your items allow for that at least. Except that you're mostly not squished into narrow hallways and are a lot more free in your movement. Each path you take toward a detonator part is basically tied to a specific idea. The first one is the most basic one of them, as you find it naturally before embarking on your way to the other 2 detonator parts. It's a sequence of simple fights inside of a mostly lightless building. One of the other detonator parts is found by traversing a collapsed skyscraper that is lying on its side. Here you also get to have a very small but cool enemy encounter, where the ground you're standing on is made up of windows. The mechanic here is clear. You can shoot the windows in order for enemies to fall through, but when you shoot too many, the integrity of that area is compromised, which makes all of the windows surrounding it break as well. Making your way through that area was a fun combat puzzle and easily my highlight of the entire Raccoon City section. Eventually you get to have another couple of fights on the top of other buildings and make your way down to street level again, looking for the next detonator part. Here, Leon gets to run across rooftops again, having to dodge mortar missiles and fight enemies wielding guns, which is similar enough to the beginning of the castle section of RE4 Remake, but not quite as charming in comparison. The shooting zombies are annoying to fight as they can reduce Leon's health to almost nothing within seconds and can't be dealt with in much more interesting ways than just shooting at them and ducking behind cover. Something which I don't really want to do in a Resident Evil game. This hunt for the detonator parts is mostly fun on its own, but definitely lacking in terms of its pacing. Having an open area connect these more linear segments is alright enough, but there's simply not enough happening while traversing from one place to the next. Where RE4 had treasures or remixed combat encounters waiting for you, Requiem mostly has nothing to offer in terms of variety in between the combat encounters. Puzzles are also basically non-existent here. There's one thing spicing up the combat encounters though. This section in the game unlocks Leon's ability to upgrade his weapons, which is very much in line with the way weapon upgrading works in RE4. Except that you upgrade your weapons at a box instead of at a merchant. And you don't spend money in order to pay for your upgrades. You spend points. Points that you earn every time after killing an enemy. The only other way to gain these points is by finding bracelets that are placed on enemies or around the game world, which have a certain amount of points stored on them. While that may be a stand-in for how treasures functioned in both versions of RE4, it is still quite different as these bracelets aren't really as much of a reward. They are not discovered in the same way as in RE4, where glowing spots would draw your attention to them, nor are there treasure maps that lead you toward them. They are simply placed around the game world and are purely relegated to being point storage and aren't interactive like the treasures were in RE4. This makes the whole weapon upgrading into quite the charmless inclusion. Instead of rooting for my next upgrades, I felt like they were handed to me pretty consistently and without much in the way of them feeling like an earned reward. It would also be pretty hard for me to say how much of a difference these upgrades really made, since you don't get that many chances to use your full kit. And also, the upgrades don't carry over to a New Game Plus playthrough, because there isn't really a New Game Plus. And while talking about the lack of charm, it doesn't just extend to the way you upgrade your weapons, it extends to the entire first Raccoon City section. The environments are utterly charmless, with boring colors and a complete lack of life in them. Which makes sense, since Raccoon City has been bombed, but it's still not entirely satisfying. And it's not even like Leon and Sherry, his remote contact he's been talking to throughout the game, who has also experienced the nightmares of RE2, get to talk a lot. The lifelessness extends to the lack of character interactions as well. There's also the complete lack of urgency and narrative developments during this section of the game. Coming from Grace's section that had a pretty relatable goal of getting out of a life-threatening situation, Leon's section's goal is to bomb open a gate and save Grace, I guess. Leon doesn't seem like he's running out of time to get through that gate, and doesn't seem like he's particularly afraid of dying of his virus infection or even worried about Grace's safety. He's just there, running between buildings in a space that is probably way too big and would have been more fun exploring if it had been more linear. Overall, the whole running through Raccoon City's ruins during daylight doesn't do much to stay interesting. If I had my way, I would either have had Leon talk to Sherry a lot more, or just made this section of the game into a more linear journey from point A to B. Having to collect 3 detonator parts is fine, I guess, but after coming off of collecting 3 key parts as Grace and then 3 electrical thingies in the sewers, I have to admit that the formula already ran dry. I would also have included some survivors. A cutscene during this section shows BSAA agents being attacked by one of the game's villains, Zeno. We'll get back to him later. Personally, I wouldn't have killed them off completely. This part of the game would have benefited from including other people for Leon to meet and talk to, because as it is, nothing really happens during this section of the game. These surviving NPCs could have revealed more about the BSAA's intentions in the area, Umbrella, the villains, anything really. There could have been some kind of emotional investment in them from Leon's side. Even if that had led to them being killed off, it would have been a lot more interesting narratively than simply running around grey buildings for 3 or so hours. Especially if you tied their inclusion into the gameplay, by having Leon defend them like he did Grace earlier in the game, when he had to snipe zombies that attacked Grace. But there's one thing here that manages to shine. The combat, even if there's not enough of it. Leon's toolkit here has been expanded a little bit in comparison to RE4. His melee attacks are now a lot more context sensitive. Leon is able to take out enemies with a single melee attack if certain conditions are met, such as them standing close to walls. Instead of being able to parry enemies with a knife like in RE4, Leon now uses a hatchet. For whatever reason, since him using the knife he got from Krauser in RE4 or even Marvin in RE2 would have been a lot more interesting narratively. This hatchet allows you to parry enemy attacks just like in RE4, except that the hatchet is unbreakable. It can be damaged to a point of the parry not working anymore, but you're able to sharpen it with the press of a button, which makes it quite overpowered. It's not even like you need an item to be able to repair it. This hatchet can also be used to kill enemies in basically a single hit as soon as they're staggered. Leon also gets to do cool finisher animations when standing close to a zombie before delivering the final shot. The entirety of the combat screams coolness and is all about the power fantasy. But it is still a bit underutilized. And the thing is, even though I've been complaining a lot about this section of the game, it's still fun. It's still fun because of Leon's gameplay alone. But knowing that the last Resident Evil game just 3 years ago did so much better on pretty much every other front, and to be honest, the gameplay there feels a bit more refined too, is what is so frustrating about this. The lack of charm, the lack of meaningful interactions or even narrative revelations. There's nothing about this segment that stands out in particular, besides the gameplay, which might be the most important thing, sure, but it's not as good as I would have hoped for it to be. And even so, I'd argue that the gameplay was more fun in the short bursts you got to experience earlier in the game, since earlier on, Grace's section was occasionally interrupted by short Leon segments, which were a lot more varied in terms of visuals as well as gameplay scenarios. The level design, the pacing, the atmosphere, even the enemy variety, it's all lacking during the entirety of the Raccoon City section. RE4 simply did all of these things better. And even more frustrating perhaps is that RE Requiem doesn't give you enough time to play with its gameplay systems, since after you've made your way through the gate, you're already on your way to the end. What follows next isn't just an incredibly silly, but admittedly entertaining section where Leon rides across destroyed Raccoon City on a bike, it's his big return to the Raccoon City Police Department. There isn't much to this section though. It's walking through some rooms, it's some pretty tame lines from Leon, not much if anything from Sherry. It's finding an item, it's finding Grace, it's Leon meeting Zeno and him not saying anything about him resembling Wesker or having the same powers as him, and it's the lead-in to the worst section of the game. Zeno shows Grace a recording of a little girl running around the Raccoon City orphanage, which was also the setting of a small and similar section in RE2 Remake. This is a playable section where we get to play as this little girl, running away from her fellow orphans who have, for some reason, turned into bald, scary, giggling girls with shining red beams for eyes. This is a ridiculous sequence. The portrayal of these girls isn't just ridiculously stupid, it's also just a terrible section to play. It's completely linear and there are multiple times where you've got nothing to do but wait. Some of it is also nonsensical and overall it's simply a slog. It was a slog on my first playthrough and it was even worse on the following ones. It's the worst section in the game. What follows this is the reintroduction of Mr. X, a short chase sequence through the RPD, a remember this sequence of Mr. Kendo and his daughter from RE2, in which Leon shows his regret toward not having been able to save them all those years ago, a boss fight against Mr. X, a descent toward an umbrella lab, a boss fight against a big scary plant like the one in RE1, a fight against human soldiers, a fight against Hunk, and another reunion with Grace and Zeno. The game finally picks up its narrative pacing again as soon as Grace appears back on screen. But I did get a lot of enjoyment out of the short fight against Hunk, who is a pretty niche character that never appeared as a playable character in a full game or anything, but is still a fan favorite anyway, because he's always been portrayed as an overly capable badass. I couldn't believe, and still can't, that they were acting this unashamed with their fan service as to go as far as to include Hunk of all possible characters. And throughout all the fan service, the game doesn't really let you play around with Leon's combat as much anymore. There are barely any zombies for him to fight for the rest of the game. Most of his enemy encounters are against special and boss enemies. The loop of knocking down enemies, fending them off with melee attacks and trying to outmaneuver them is pretty much gone. Unfortunately, just when the game picks up the narrative again, it falls on its face. The game has a lot of moving parts that don't really come together. I'll try not to be too CinemaSins here. I don't want to point out every inconsistency or be too nitpicky. RE games aren't really popular because of their stories, but what was important for these games, and what is important, are the characters. And I don't think they come off particularly well here. Let's start with Zeno. Zeno is introduced at the end of Grace's section at Rhodes Hill. And it's very obvious that his appearance and mannerisms are meant to evoke Wesker's. Wesker being the most popular villain in the franchise and the recurring big bad for the first couple of entries. The thing though, he's been dead since RE5. Him being here is a huge deal. The intrigue of him revealing himself at the end of Grace's section only for the POV to switch to Leon was a huge part of what made this switch so intriguing. Instead of following up on him and Grace, we'd get a bigger build-up toward Wesker's return. Or so I thought. To be honest, I wasn't even sure if it was Wesker. This would be his first proper appearance in an RE Engine game. Sure, he was an RE4 remake, but he wasn't this prevalent. His new voice actor has also not been ingrained into my mind as much as his VA from RE5, so I wasn't entirely sure it was him, or maybe at least a clone of his. The way the game handles all this is confusing. He's introduced to Leon as part of a video recording he finds. He makes Sherry look him up, even she can't find any info on him. A little later in the RPD, he finally meets Zeno. Zeno dodges Leon's shots just like he did to Chris and Sheva during his boss fight in RE5. His eyes glow under his sunglasses. Even if this isn't Wesker, it has to be a clone. But Leon doesn't even say anything about these very obvious connections. It is true that Leon is the only one out of the main 4 Resi main characters who hasn't met him. But shouldn't he, as involved as he is in the world of bioterrorism, be aware of one of the biggest bads in that scene? I suppose not. At that point I didn't care too much though. I was imagining a face-off between Leon and Wesker. Something that fans, including me, have been wanting for a long time. It could have been a legendary moment. But in the end, Leon never even gets to fight him, at least not during gameplay. By the way, Zeno literally only exists in cutscenes. He's never seen or interacted with outside of them. Zeno gets unceremoniously killed by Victor just before the final fight. Victor being the actual main villain of the game. This is also where Victor calls him an imitation, a soft confirmation of him being a clone, I guess. But in the end I must ask, why include him in the first place? His whole inclusion ended up basically being nothing more than an easy way to build intrigue, without any meaningful payoff whatsoever, which makes this whole thing stink. Then there's Victor, who is the true and final villain of the game. He disappears for a good chunk of the game after having been highly relevant during Grace's Rhodes Hill section. I'm not even going to start outright questioning what his deal with Grace was, but I will question how he was treated as a villain. Him disappearing for half the game just to randomly show back up at the end and turn into a nemesis. Another bit of fan service, and for what? I thought he'd be the main villain for the entire duration of the game, even in his absence, but I thought there would be more to him. But there wasn't. What is especially weird is that Grace doesn't get to fight him. He's the one who made her go through the nightmare of Rhodes Hill. He is one of the people responsible for her mother's death. Grace is the one he has a connection to, not Leon. In the end, just as he reappears on a whim, he dies like a wimp, possibly making him the lamest final boss in the recent RE games, and that is incredibly disappointing, because all of his appearances beforehand made him seem like a pretty interesting character. His quirks and appearance were unique, and his voice acting cheesy in the best possible way. It seemed like they were building up to him being an iconic villain, but in the end, there wasn't really anything to him. What a waste of a character. The weird treatment of Grace doesn't just start or end with her not having any involvement in the final confrontation against him. Throughout the game, it is not just implied, it is stated that Grace is special, for a reason we are not made aware of. We can speculate that it's because of her blood, we can guess that she is a clone, we can guess that she has some sort of immunity, we can guess so many things. In the end, it doesn't really matter, since nothing is special about her, really. Victor and Zeno merely assumed she was special. They merely assumed she was the one who would know the password for Elpis, the game's big MacGuffin the villains have been searching for many years. We are given no explanation, nothing really, as to why the villains expected her to be the key to this entire thing. I don't even mind her not being special. I even prefer it to the alternative, and yet it just makes me wonder, what were the villains thinking? At this point, the plot is being held together by vibes only. It turns out that she is the adopted daughter of Oswald E. Spencer, the original big bad who came up with the first viruses. It is not clear if she is just a random child he decided to adopt out of the goodness of his heart, or if she was one of his experiments that he wanted to save from a worse fate. I personally interpreted it as Grace just having been some random girl he tried to adopt, which is fine. Sure, but if anything, I would have liked to understand why these villains were so fixated on her specifically. Let me say here that I did really enjoy Grace's character though. She's probably the most anxious and perhaps the least physically capable RE main character we've ever had, but that is what makes her so entertaining. She stutters her way through most conversations, is terrible at holding eye contact, and just seems incredibly awkward, to a point where you could doubt how she'd even be able to work at the FBI, but that is beside the point. Her being so anxious and scared makes her feats in this game even more impressive. Through all of her angst, she decides to keep going. She decides to save other people instead of taking the easier way out. Grace goes headfirst into danger because she knows what's right, even if she's scared shitless the entire time. By the end, Grace is a true hero and incredibly capable in her own right. The way she uses her wits to get out of perilous situations might actually show her as more intellectually capable than most of the other cast, at least in a survival situation like this, where brain can be more powerful than brawn.
Grace! Grace! Grace!
Grace's ending seems perfectly fitting to her character. I wouldn't complain if we never saw her again, but I don't think I would complain if she reappeared either. And I do wonder what they've got in store for her, if anything at all. And since we're already talking about characters that will possibly never appear again, Resident Evil 2 didn't just star Leon and Sherry. Arguably, Leon and Sherry don't even have as much of a connection as may be implied in Requiem. The character that actually saved Sherry during the events of RE2 was Claire. RE2 gives players the choice to either play the game as Leon or as Claire, both of them being new characters, though Claire being Chris Redfield's sister, one of the two main characters from RE1. This makes Claire into just as much of a main player in RE2 as Leon, and arguably more relevant for this game's story, as she is the one who spent the most time with Sherry, and since she is the one who actually entered the orphanage that you also get to revisit in this game. And yet, Claire is never mentioned during the game's story, not even a single time. If anything, the game should have starred both Leon and Claire, since the virus is affecting survivors of Raccoon City, including Sherry, by the way. We could at the very least have gotten a mention of Claire in order to show how she's dealing with her infection. Canonically, Claire works for TerraSave, an organization that sets out to help victims of bioterrorism. Her now being affected herself and being on the brink of dying would have been reason enough for her to get involved in the story, and yet no mention whatsoever. The same thing goes for Ada. Her lack of involvement in the plot is even more confusing. Leon and Ada go hand in hand, RE2, RE4, RE6. Every game Leon appeared in as a main playable character also included Ada. Their will they won't they relationship may have almost been reduced to irrelevance by RE4 Remake, but still. The parts of RE2 that diverge in between playthroughs with the different characters, the parts where Claire meets Sherry, are where Leon meets Ada on his side of the game, which also means that she is one of the survivors, which also means that she is presumably infected with the virus that is killing Raccoon City survivors. Ada has always been shown as cunning. She's pretty much an elite secret spy. There is no way she would not go out of her way to find a cure for herself and possibly even Leon and everyone else. Yet there is no appearance, no mention, nothing. Not even when Leon enters the parking garage of the RPD, where he first met the woman that saved his life multiple times and the woman he very obviously had a gigantic crush on. Then there's Jill. Jill is a highly contentious subject within the fandom. Jill hasn't appeared in a completely new game since RE Revelations 1. After being degraded to a highly sexualized subject of mind control in RE5, she's pretty much been MIA narratively. While she did appear in the animated movie Resident Evil Death Island, that doesn't really matter. Her character hasn't really moved forward in the games. For everyone who has played the games, her story will have ended in RE5 as a subject of mind control and nothing more than that, even though she is the character that started it all, right alongside Chris in RE1. RE5 released 17 years ago now. It's been a long time, and the thing is, Jill would arguably have had the biggest reason to go back to Raccoon City. Out of the 3 main playable characters that were involved in the outbreak and who survived it, she's the only one who lived in that city. She's the only one who worked in the RPD. She's the one who witnessed firsthand the events of the actual outbreak right as it happened, as well as the events at Spencer Mansion. As a consequence of this, she eventually got mind controlled by Wesker. If any character had a reason to go back to Raccoon City and find a way to end Umbrella once and for all, had a reason to face off against Wesker, even a clone of his, it would be her. And yet, here we are, no mention of her whatsoever, even though she too is presumably dying from the virus. This arguably makes the whole framing of RE9 being this big return to Raccoon City and a celebration of the 30th anniversary of the series into a bit of a questionable choice. There isn't much here to celebrate the series at all, and there wasn't really that big of a reason to return to Raccoon City. The framing of Raccoon City survivors being affected by a deadly mutation of the original but dormant T-virus is incredibly compelling, but the game doesn't do anything with this. Not for all of the characters we've known from prior games, and definitely not for Leon or Sherry either. Leon walks off the events of the game as if the virus didn't matter, and Sherry herself doesn't seem to be too afraid about dying either. Leon walks off the events of the game as if the virus doesn't matter. The subject of dying barely even comes up for Leon. His actions very much imply that he would be alright with dying, if that meant foiling the villain's plot and saving Grace, to atone for his failure in Raccoon City all those years ago. But still, the game barely makes a point of it. Even the sequence toward the ending, where Leon is about to die on his way to the final confrontation with Zeno and then Victor, it feels incredibly milquetoast compared to the very similar sequence from RE4. The plaga he was infected with in that game felt a lot more dangerous than the Raccoon City virus ever did. In the end, this interesting choice for framing the story and instigating the plot didn't really lead to much of anything, beside questions about why all of this was necessary if the game didn't even end up addressing the consequences of it to any satisfying degree. The 30-year-old legacy here doesn't end up having any meaningful relevance for the plot. The stakes for Leon aren't there, other main characters from previous games are unmentioned throughout, Zeno is an aura-farming fanservice character that ends up doing nothing, Raccoon City is grey and simply boring, the RPD is a 10-minute nostalgia trip without anything interesting being done or even said there, Mr. X is pure fanservice, Plant 43 is mere fanservice, Hunk is fanservice. It almost seems like the only reason this game went for nostalgia is to include these fanservice moments, not to do anything interesting with it for the sake of narrative. This makes the game's internal division even clearer. The first half of the game is clear, concise and intriguing all on its own. That is, before we even get to Raccoon City. Sure, the Raccoon City virus is a thing, Umbrella is a thing in form of Victor, and toward the end Zeno is a thing as well. But all of these things only lead to intrigue that isn't followed up on in the second half of the game to any satisfying degree. Because the second half of the game goes all in on nostalgia, in terms of enemies and callbacks and the setting itself of course, and yet it holds back. Characters aren't mentioned and there's no real progress. There's nothing there beyond the empty promise of nostalgia. The game only ends up finding its footing once you reach the final lab area, but even then, the resolution isn't satisfying at all. Resident Evil Requiem is a game of two halves, a great first half that can largely stand on its own, and a less great second half that falls apart narratively in almost every conceivable way, while at the very least being largely convincing in its gameplay. The first half, starring Grace, is, while not my favorite survival horror experience in the series, still great in its own right. The other half, the Resident Evil 4 knockoff without any of its design brilliance or any narrative hooks like the ones from the Grace segment, is not particularly good. It's still alright, but it pales both in comparison to other games in the series as well as its very own first half. Quite simply, it's a big step down. Where do we go from here? It's going to be a while until Resident Evil 10. Rumors already point toward the next Resident Evil game being a remake of Code Veronica, a game starring Claire as well as Chris. another game with 2 playable characters within a single narrative, and another game that may try to combine survival horror as well as action horror into one. It will include the first proper Wesker appearance in the new era of games, and it may be a much better game than Requiem. Since the team behind RE2 Remake and RE4 Remake seems to be working on it, I'm already more than optimistic. But for now, just a couple of weeks or a bit of a month after Requiem's release, I can't say that my initial feelings on the game have changed, really. The game is fun enough in its own right. In most ways, it's a good game even. But considering how good Resident Evil games have been over the last decade and how good the remake of Resident Evil 4 was, I can't help but be a bit disappointed. Requiem isn't what I wanted, but it being a disappointment says more about how good the other games have been than about how middling it really was. No matter what, Resident Evil will keep going, and presumably it will keep going for at least another 30 years.